Asia, including the Philippines, and even in America. In the end, it was Roosevelt's reforms in the United States that perhaps saved capitalism in the sense that the government proved itself capable of leadership that could earn the trust and confidence of its people. By so doing, FDR made it possible to put forward American capitalism and government as ally to and leader of the democracies eventually destined to challenge Hitler and later the Soviets. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt had firmly declared that the only thing people had to fear was fear itself. The fear that had sowed panic in the stock market that we saw in Part 1, then in the banks, and the panic that made people believe in Italy, Germany, Japan, and Russia that they were prepared to give up their freedoms to move their countries forward. So when we return, we'll ask a couple of frequent guests to walk us through how policymakers look back on the Great Depression for lessons in facing the crises and opportunities confronting us today.
Books featured by the explainer are available on shelves or on order at a different bookstore.
Joining us is attorney Jemmy Gatdula, columnist for Business World and a blogger, and a lecturer of international economic law at Ateneo Law School. And he's joined by Rafi Madarang, a lecturer on political economy at the University of Asia and the Pacific. And both gentlemen are with KPMG. I get that right?
Yes.
So good evening to you both. Okay, let me start by something that you were preparing for publication, but you put on your blog right away a couple of weeks back, even before all of this was unfolding, Jemmy. And you were concerned that because everyone was getting so nervous about what was happening in New York and the potential fallout from the collapse of Bear Stearns and other entities in Wall Street, that countries, in a sense, would want to sort of close their borders, restrict trade, become protectionist, and basically reverse all of the things that they've been trying to do for the past decade. Could you expound on this a bit?
Well, it's one of those things that started, and that started, perhaps I could say, from the last year, from 2007, when the subprime thing exploded. Coincidentally, there's this view of thought that there's supposed to be a boom and bust cycle. And 2007 coincidentally turned out to be the 100th anniversary of the 1907 Great Panic. So in a way, it seems to be starting out a series of events by which countries seemingly would want to close down their borders, slow down immigration, slow down the exchange of capital and trade with each other.
With the objective of protecting their industries and the jobs of their citizens.
Essentially to stabilize, although it is logical for them to think that, it may not be the best thing to do, as we have seen in the recent history which we've discussed earlier. And a lot of it is, funnily enough, seemingly quite familiar, considering the things that have happened before, especially during 1907 and 1929.
Okay, now, as these things were taking place, a lot of talk was made of the fact that the U.S. Federal Reserve is now headed by a person Bernanke, who considers himself an expert on who studied the 1929 crash quite thoroughly, and that added to the sort of the excitement people were looking at how things were unfolding. Now, when you're looking at these events unfolding, let me ask you a philosophical question that most people are asking. Many of these banks and brokerage houses that are now on their knees are at that point because they were inventing all sorts of different papers and means of selling and swapping and trading debt and even creating that debt. And so why should governments and indirectly the citizens be bailing these giant companies out? That's what people don't find fair.
Well, perhaps Rafi could...
Well, these organizations and these businesses actually have a direct public impact in that regard. So, and that's the reason why, especially in the case of AIG, when the government prepared an $85 billion bailout for it, it was in regard of its public interest character, since it was insuring a lot of major companies in the United States and a lot of individuals.
Okay, let's go into AIG, which was the insurance giant, because this was when the whole thing hit home in many ways, because there are many Filipinos, for example, who have insurance policies and other instruments that come from AIG. Now, the way I understood it, and you can correct me if I have it wrong, is that what basically AIG did as an insurer was insure the debt of banks. Now, the advantage of this to banks is that they normally have to have a certain amount of cash and other assets on hand to cover whatever debts there are. If they have these debts insured, it frees up capital that they can even lend out and play around and that sort of thing. The problem is that if people start doubting the capacity of the insurer to pay just in case the bank goes bust, then the bank in turn has to pull out money from circulation and put it back in as a reserve. And the problem was, since all the banks were now paranoid of each other, no one was willing to lend money to each other, and this was the danger. Now, if this is the case, again, the question is, no one was telling AIG to insure all of these things that no one seemed quite to understand. So again, why are global governments stepping in?
Well, I think it's really human nature. People really seem to be quite confident in times when things are going good, and suddenly they start panicking when things are going bad. And the funny thing is that none of these things that we're experiencing now seemingly are, in essence, different from what happened in 2007 and in 1929. People essentially were doing the same thing, taking out incredibly huge amount of loans without even thinking whether or not they could pay back. Mm-hmm. People were speculating on stocks, and then it all came crashing back on people. With regard to certain situations, like you mentioned, Ben Bernanke, the problem with reliance on the fact that whether or not he did study the 1929 crash is still subject to debate. Whether or not the bailout that he has actually given will be quite successful, still, even in recent news just a couple of hours ago, seems to be quite up in the air. The thing is that the Fed at that time had far different powers than the Fed has now.
Because as a consequence of that crash,
yeah, and then one of the reasons why they were not able to act, and a lot of criticism came because of the fact that they seemed so passive, was because of the fact that they were not able to, or were not authorized to give that amount of capital to those banks or companies. The other thing is that there were different philosophies running at that time. People were really thinking that just let the market and it will correct itself. It will be probably a decade or two later when Keynes would probably come in and say that no, the governments have to step in and essentially help out. And that apparently came in 1936 when he was writing his general theory of employment.
Okay, we have a question from the floor.
Yes, we have a question here from Monzit regarding Lehman Brothers.
Yes, it's far. I mean, you can see it all around the news now that the Lehman Brothers crash is occurring in the States. Now, my question is how does this affect the Philippine stock exchange market in general? And I mean, did we pick up any lessons from the 1929 crash on how to prevent such occurrences, such as the crash of the Lehman Brothers Bank?
Yeah. Well, since the Philippine stock exchange is actually tied almost technically to the U.S. stock market, we will be affected by the movements in the U.S. market in that respect. I mean, we have some banks here that indeed had certain investments with the Lehman Brothers, and those too would also have their share of exposures. So indeed, it would not be true to say that we are not affected by these circumstances and by the events taking place in the U.S. But we have learned a lot of lessons, not just from the 1929 crash, but also with the 1997 financial crisis, for example, in which a lot of regulatory measures have already been put in place, not just in the Philippines, but a lot of the economies in Asia, in order to withstand these types of crises. But of course, that's what's coming into play right now.
But here's something, before we go to the question on our screen, here's something that I find very interesting, because I'm not a numbers guy, is there's a human element to all of this. That you can put in all the good regulation and which learns from the lessons of the past, but when there's a panic, there's a panic. So when for example, you're teaching your class or you're talking to your fellow professionals, how do you come to grips with this sort of thing?
Actually, I was about to say that. I mean, we did learn a lot of lessons, not only from 1997, but the thing is, the human element would just essentially come in. The thing is, policymakers don't move in a bubble, and they still have to go through with the politics that surrounds the policy making. One of the funny things is that during the 1929 crash, one of the first reactions of the Filipinos was, logically, should have been